Hello and welcome to the Sunday Spotlight. I apologize for the many troubles we've had with Twitter Spaces. Um, for some reason, Twitter decided that they're just going to turn me off whenever they want. I'm not sure if it's Twitter actually or their servers or whatever, but it was deeply upsetting. On to greener pastures, though. I suppose I'm just going to live stream this, and then offer membership to those of the Dark Ocean Society of Literary Merit, or whatever I'm calling them, to make comments or discuss the issues, or just not. It's all good to me. Today's subject is Francis Schaeffer's masterpiece, How Should We Then Live, especially the last two sections about the modern world and the drug culture and the destruction of drug culture, especially. Francis Schaeffer was a theologian, philosopher, Presbyterian minister. Married, kids, started a group called L'Abri in Scotland. Switzerland. I don't know why I said Scotland, but he does have a sort of Scottish beard and haircut, I think. Kind of the philosopher's beard. Kind of John Knoxian, I guess I'm going to say, but not as long. He had quite a few different ideas that he went for. Not all of them as useful as you might want. Partially because, how should I put it? He had some doubts about things like the Holy Spirit, from what I understand. Though, quite frankly, I view it as far from far too much thinking than it is from some sort of like heretical view of God, particularly. There's heresies that come from denying an aspect of God, and then there are heresies from I'm overthinking how this acts, and it's not as simple as it states in the Bible or other places. That's why I bring that up for those Christians in the audience who take these things very seriously. It's sort of like Vox Day's argument against what do I want to say? Vox Day's arguments against the omniscience of Jesus Christ is like technically there are things that Jesus Christ does not know. Basically, when he's coming back. However, that does not. He calls it omnidiligence. I'm not quite sure on the exact meaning of the word. But it's used in a way that's all omniscient except one thing, which I think is indistinguishable but very important. You would say normally that Christ is omniscient. However, technically, there is one thing he does not know. So it's things like that. Most of the time I've seen it. His big work was about humanism. Humanism is one of the big things of our time that is pulling reason from man himself. And I'm going to put in some information now that he himself said. Humanism, in the larger, more inclusive sense, is a system whereby men and women, beginning absolutely by themselves, try rationally to build out from themselves, having only man as their integration point, to find all knowledge, meaning, and value. We must also ensure that the word rationalism, which means the same thing as humanism in the wider sense, is not confused with the word rational. Rational means that the things which are about us are not contrary to reason, or to put it another way, man's aspiration of reason is valid. And so the Judeo-Christian position is rational, but it is the very antithesis of rationalism. Stuff like that's very important. His great work, How Should We Then Live, though he has other works that are equally important, except, shall we say, less marketable to the normal man. What what I was saying is how should we then live, where he goes over history of humanism and its relationship to Christianity through the ancient times of the Romans into about the 1970s when he finished the book. He is absolutely prescient in his in what he writes about, much more than you would think for a gentleman of the 1970s who was born at a time where they barely had radio. These things are very, very interesting. Quite frankly, it's the biggest influence on me and how I view the world. Fundamentally, I do view the entire world as a system. This system can be understood by us. In other words, God is not as deep a mystery, though God is very deep. He is not as deep a mystery as people like to say. I am not a Mohammedan. Things don't become, from God, randomly. Everything's from God all the time. These random things. If I hit the American pig dogs, inshallah, etc., etc. So I just fire without aiming. Like that's not how I work. Excuse me. And so, because I have that view of an entire round spherical view of the world and of history, I do try to study its greater movements. How should we then live is, of course, the inspiration for that. It charts the great movement of morality, of society, of humanism within the world going forward and into our modern day, ending with the baby boomers as the notable generation he discusses. Um, Even though this isn't exactly the same generational turning model that has been put forward with the hero generation and so on and so forth, it is pretty close. So I am going to put into the show's description and into the chat. Let me see here. A link to How Should We Then Live, the sort of collection. The reason why I'm going to do this is because it is free online for everybody to listen to. He had a 10 video series or something similar to that, and it inspired me quite a bit. I listened to it when I was young. I already had a big interest in things like the arts, as well as big interest in things like the arts, as well as just life in general and the various existences people can have. That's a bad link. There we go. It goes without saying that without a founding philosophy and idea that a person can follow, they follow to any sort of way. Back in the day, of our great grandfather's day, there was a very strong idea of society. It was not as strong as, say, the medievalist view of society, which was very strong indeed. However, it did. How do I want to put it? Like all things, it degrades. At some point, the medieval society would have looked very much like the ancient Roman society during the Republic, where the Romans, the High Republic especially, where the Romans were one people and they were very strongly interrelated in a societal sort of way, where corruption could be fought and was fought quite a few times. Fabius Maximus, during the Second Punic War, is actually known for his religious reformations to the Roman religion, but actually, in actuality, he stomped out corruption, made sure people returned to the rules as the rules were, rather than creating new rules. Right? He didn't go back and become a new Numa. Rather, he revived the Roman religious portion of the state. In the same way, the medievalists were of one mind, and there was a Reformation. The Reformation flowed from certain ideas in the medieval period, as you might imagine, namely the humanism of the 13th century church. This humanism, like I said, has man as its center. Now, keep in mind that they were still worshiping God. After the Reformation, they were still worshiping God, but they were outside the teachings of a single church. Now, of course, I view as a Protestant that that church was corrupted, and I know many other people agree, even if Catholics don't. However, I would suppose that there was, in fact, a counter Reformation, which means that the Catholics did, in fact, believe that they needed to change. Therefore, so on and so forth. Flowing from there, humanism grew. You had people like Rousseau, Voltaire, a lot of Frenchies in the Enlightenment who pursued that humanism more rigorously, but they had a solidly Christian society. That solidly Christian society was not the weak thing we live in now. That is not to say God is weak or Christ is weak or anything like that, but rather that society, as we know it now, is a pale imitation of the society that Rousseau and Voltaire and others rebelled against. That's the reason why the French Revolution was so wild and wacky and bloody, is because they were revolting against something very real and very powerful. In fact, I would say that they couldn't have gotten it more off the floor if it wasn't for the churchmen who supported men like Robespierre. Pardon me. From the French Revolution and on to further subjects, the humanism simply grew. You had men like Napoleon, and you had men like the later Habsburgs, who were fairly humanistic, even if they were either or religiously motivated. Napoleon may have been a great man and not necessarily a Christian, but he acted in certain Christian ways and Christian virtues. The Christianity of men like Robert Guiscard and others who, quite frankly, may or may not have been Christian, but of also men like Oliver Cromwell who were, has started to wane at this point. It's what Nietzsche talks about in his book about God dead and man has killed him, about sort of the weakness he's starting to see in society, the lack of meaning. It took hundreds and hundreds of years to for humanism to eat away at the foundations of Christianity and its power over society. What Christianity offered society was not a don't do this, or God will smite your dick. He's gonna smite your dick if you slut that prostitute, okay? And then the priest goes and touches an altar boy or something. That's not what we're describing here. What we're describing is that all society that was Christian, European society, and American society as well, Canadian and kind of South American society in a slightly different way, but kind of, had a series of guaranteed morals that we all worked around. In other words, while we did not have radical freedom, total freedom, if you prefer, we had liberty. In other words, we had a freedom without chaos. A man could go and do a such and such a thing, and it would be all right. He could start a lumber mill in the Ozarks or something, and it wouldn't be a moral question. It was understood that the world needed to be under the stewardship of good men, that sort of thing. Therefore, even if he had to be and have no workplace safety or something, it was hey, if you injure yourself, that's on you, kind of thing, rather than a nannyist state. That's what I guess what I'm trying to describe here. There's a loss of freedom for safety, which I'll describe in a little bit. As these things evolved, man became more and more grounded in the real of real life instead of the real of God, or at the very least of higher powers. This means that unlike shall we say, um, Men like Oliver Cromwell, who fought to preserve England as he thought God had raised him up to preserve England. You have people working raw politic, men like Otto von Bismarck and others who played the concert of Europe and other things like that, were not themselves very dedicated to the things of the higher nature. Men like St. Louis, who were, still played a certain political game, but in reality, St. Louis was very much protected by God and by men who were in awe of him because of his holiness. He sort of like whipped all the way back around into being fearsome and unrebellable against, though, you know, people still tried. People always try to be rebels. Um, because his men saw him walk the walk and talk the talk. So, in other words, he wasn't a hypocrite about his Christianity. He was a martial man, he was a Christian, and those two things didn't, and he was a king, and he acted in the supreme kingly way that his men, fell in love with, quite frankly. Uh, anyway, you can read what they say about him. It's an interesting balance between telling the truth and glazing the man, which is it's kind of amusing to read. It's a great read of those times because his exploits are amazing, but at the same time they're very realistic. He didn't fight 100 Saracens or whatever. He crammed himself into a tree so that they could only come at him one at a time, and then he killed like four of them. Still a heroic act. That's the sort of thing. Like, they told the truth, but it wasn't really propaganda. Um, in that way. Any good knight could probably fight, four men one on one in a narrow ravine. But nowadays, there's an actual propaganda machine. There's a lot of lies within society. You don't have a king. You don't have powerful forces within society to maintain and control it outside of man's own desires. So what happened in the 1910s to 40s is that the World War One and World War Two were actually rebellions against that sort of humanism. The Not totally, they rebelled against other things as well, but it was a strike back against, or a reaffirmation of, the humanism that was developing within a Western society. Um, you had the communisms going towards Marxism, old Marxism, I'm going to call it, because there's a new Marxism that's coming up. Uh, Leninism, I guess, might be a bit better. You had who were totally human and believed in, equality as a perfect virtue. Then you had men like the Nazis and Mussolini, who held the state above all, but also had a love for their own people. Differently than what we would call a love for their people. But I would say that if you were to weigh it, there was more love for their people than what we experience now. Uh, you also had things like, uh, America leaving its isolationist roots. This wasn't a good thing, but it was, sort of a thing that happened at that time that started to develop the problems we see today. They interacted and entered the war on the side of humanism, and they won. Even though the Nazis and the fascists in general were all humanistic in their own way, they were still connected to the earth of their people. They weren't, Francisco Franco was a patriot of Spain, for example. Even though I would say that he worked towards his own power, he also worked against those who would destroy the place he would call his nation. Uh, Going into the modern world, however, on the backs of those two world wars where humanism has won out, you had multiple generations, namely men like the Greatest Generation and the Silent Generation, less so, but still there, and the generations like the Lost Generation, who had gone through so much trouble, depression, world wars, communism, and so on and so forth, that they finally rejected God and became apathetic. They had two big values that all of society worked itself around. That is personal peace and affluence. You can view this, and it has a handmaiden that I'll talk about in a minute. You can view personal peace and affluence as the real religion of America, Europe, the West at this time. It has completely supplanted Christianity. We do not have a Christian society. We have the shambling corpse of a Christian society piloted by two imbeciles. Personal peace is a libertarian dream, but it can be applied to more than libertarians. Personal peace says, I wish to be undisturbed even even to the detriment of all others, including my children. Now, that detriment can be anything from, say, not a boomer not leaving an inheritance to letting in a lot of foreigners and immigrants to, whatever you want to call it. And while the boomers are definitely the poster children, it's strongest soldier. In reality, this is before the boomers, right? From like I want to say the lost generation on, and before a little bit too, but definitely the greatest generation. They lived that and kept a certain amount of Christian morality. Uh, that does not mean they were nice people or anything like that, and it doesn't mean that they were Christian. It just means that they had a modicum of Christian morality defining the absolutes of their society. The absolutes of their society changed with the boomers because the boomers received finally the inheritance, the handmaiden of personal peace and affluence. That is apathy. This created a system of no fixed values, pessimism, especially. Whereas as a Christian, I say, sexual immorality is wrong. God demands that there be, one man and one woman together. Now they should be fucking, but pardon my language, but one man, one woman. We can see it in the Bible. This is what God wants. This is very clear. But from a humanistic personal peace and affluence perspective, there's actually no way to say that, right? If you say that, you're actually not really basing it on anything concrete or rational. In other words, for those whose biggest religion are personal peace and affluence, they you can't you're allowed to be gay, essentially. You're allowed to be transsexual. You're allowed to be in love with your car. There's no moral ultimate power that prevents you from um, denying that these things are legitimate. That's why we see so much degeneracy. We understand that these things are wrong, that they are degenerate. There's still people out there who pick Rey over Asuka. It's degenerate. But how do you argue against it? Well, the Evangelion Bible, says something, something, something. Okay, Asuka's best girl. Okay, you look at the Evangelion Bible and it says Asuka's best girl. You can lock your morality on that and choose Asuka as best girl. It's things like that. That's just a funny example. But the in the more serious terms, it's the homosexual question, and it's one very powerful movement that is often denigrated in the online right. That is even more important. That is abortion. I'm going to go over this one later in detail because it is that important. Because it is a part of the definition of what's a human. Now, to go back to the timeline of events, which is very important, as the boomers entered college and became adults, they revolted against personal peace and affluence. And even though that's a weird thing to hear about baby boomers, they did have a moment in the sun where they realized that their lives are empty, that they have to fight and rise against the things that are suppressing them. Unfortunately, that didn't lead anywhere. It's part of a setup I like to call the spiritual crisis of the 1970s. Other people call it the Fourth Great Awakening. In reality, the baby boomers pursued two big religions: drug culture ideology and the New Left. Uh, essentially what happened was because they no longer had that Christian society, because fundamentally the great personal peace and affluence does not transfer over a Christian worldview. Uh, they revolted. They realized that reason doesn't give a meaning. So without their objective truth, they sought truth from things like drugs. Apathy is the handmaiden. I said, well, if you're high, you were apathetic. You can rebel against certain things if you're ginned up by somebody else, but fundamentally, most of these student movements, like the Berkeley riots and others, were defeated. And by 1970, drug culture itself died. The drugs remained, of course, but the idea that you can achieve salvation is now a curiosity rather than an actual serious movement. Remember, Aldous Huxley talks about this in great detail in his Brave New World book. That's the biggest example you're going to see. It's the most obvious example that I think most everyone has read. The next step is with the new left. Its other god that the boomers chose went to things like the Weather Underground, in a period of intense, the Days of Rage, a period of intense leftist violence that eventually rewarded the people with tenure of all things. There wasn't any karmic justice except hell for these people. So essentially, their two gods failed the baby boomers utterly. They did not want to turn to God to really become Christians again or to choose a Christian society. Rather, they still wanted the personal peace and affluence, but they wanted personal peace and affluence with meaning. Now, again, that's strange, right? You can't, the personal peace and affluence is meaningless, but they still demanded meaning. Well, that's part of the apathy. Fundamentally, they understood that there has to be a society, and that society must have absolutes. But they weren't willing to actually become uncomfortable to take them. It's like somebody who wants to be thin but never diets. I struggle with diets myself. I also want to be thin. It creates a tension within myself. Now, if I'm, smart, if I'm an intelligent person, I'm going to eat less, stop stuffing my fat face. I'm going to choose the more virtuous lifestyle. Fundamentally, all boomers failed at least some part of that trial. Think about it like in Revelation, where Jesus gives the churches, hey, you're messing up because you let this thought in, and she's, fucking everybody and leading them astray because she's trying to be Joyce Myers. Oops. Uh, don't do that. And if you reject that, if you overcome this Jezebel, you will receive a crown. The baby boomers could have overcome their personal peace and affluence, and they could have received a crown. They could have been the greatest generation of all time, like the GOAT. And I mean that unironically. If they had become virtuous, if they had given up personal peace and affluence, they would have enjoyed a golden age that 10,000 years they still would have been talked about, like the Roman golden age. Instead, they rejected it. They rejected the new left, they rejected drug culture, and instead apathetically went back to personal peace and affluence. They had a society without a soul, and they were perfectly fine with it. Now, you might say, well, they weren't fine with it, blah, 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 blah. And you had things like Black Pilled does some great stuff about video reviews, about those motorcyclists and other things, and nothing really matters, and we're just a dust bag in the wind or something. Steven Spielberg films. But in reality, that's just apathy, entertainment. Like my mom is an English woman, baby boomer, and she still gets stuck, kind of Generation Jones, but she still gets stuck on Steven Spielberg society. Pardon me. I got to keep the throat moist. Moist. So, from the hole that is in baby boomers' hearts, Many of them were satisfied with personal peace and affluence and their apathy. They were 1 inch lower than their parents somehow, and their parents were already pretty low. From that hole came New Marxism and other things like that. New Marxism is the thing that we're fighting with now: clown world, the gay, um, GNC, whatever you want to call it. Uh, it's the result of the baby boomers giving up and accepting things like New Marxism. Uh, the law was destroyed and became variable. We call this now anarcho tyranny. This is all things Francis Schaeffer is talking about, by the way. I'm just giving it more of a spin because we have 50 years on the dude. He can't he can't be expected to know what a gay is or anything like that. What a clown world is. With the law destroyed, even larger things holding society together. So let's imagine Christianity as a kind of engine that keeps a train going. However, the train has a ton of momentum. Its wheels are well greased. Its rails are well maintained. It's on a downward slope. And I don't mean as in it's dying downward. I mean, it's got a little bit of momentum carrying itself on. It's still running even though the engine's turned off. However, people are now starting to, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, steal the grease, replace the good wheels with bad wheels, look for ways to go uphill rather than continuing on a comfortable downward slope that would keep them moving. The biggest thing that people pick up on are things like abortion. Now, I understand that, abortion is, just a second, let's grease those wheels. Uh, Abortion is kind of a dirty word, not because of any particular, how do I want to put it, intrinsic value, but because of how people politically spark on it. The problem that with abortion that all right-wing groups should sort of consider in a very serious way is not as political expedience, but rather what it means to the law and the law of the land in general. When be, because of this abortion law, Western law lost the ability to define a person. I'm going to say that again. Because of the abortion law, Western law lost the ability to define a person. If a baby is not a person, then something like white isn't a person, man isn't a person. Previous times, this was done in slavery to the black man. And you might say, well, tit for tat. No, 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 no. This is a different thing. The black man, as a slave, could not be murdered with impunity. There's a reason why Ku Klux Klan members had to hide their faces. It was a murder to lynch a black man without a trial. Whether or not he did it, I'm not arguing this here, because let's be real, a lot of them did it. And so did that one fella, the ADL likes to champion. He certainly did it, but they still had to hide their faces. We don't know who they are. We don't know who organized it other than the general society, right? They were people who were lynched. With this new definition under abortion law and the abortion ideas that were introduced to the law, there is person and non-person. If a baby is not a person, white isn't a person. White man isn't a person. It means that there's ways to remove personhood within the law. That's what I'm trying to get at. I want to repeat it just because it's very important. Politically, there is a Christian element of, the poor babies. But practically, Machiavellianly, whatever you want to call it, beyond just, the poor babies created in the image of God, there is a real threat that they can just say, you aren't a person anymore. And if you aren't a person anymore, the laws, which no longer have a absolute moral backing from God, from the Christian perspective, lose their ability to protect you objectively from a lynch mob. Except, unlike before, they will no longer have any personhood to ascribe to you. It's like saying when we watch a news thing and it says, white man drove into, or name, Bob, drove into a crowd versus car ran into a crowd. Everyone listening knows exactly what I'm talking about and the difference between those two things. We see it happening. What I'm describing is not a theory or a conspiracy. It's not fake. It's a very real existence that we live in today. Uh, Now, keep in mind that the law still protects decently well, but especially from a media perspective and from certain things within the law, that stuff has a basis from which it can be removed from protecting us. We see it especially with things like MAID or with the genetic modification that's happening now. Uh, and there's no A4s, there's no ultra elite power over the children to prevent bad children from being born. Excuse me. Sorry. Or excuse me, from reaching maturity. The A4s of Sparta fundamentally loved Sparta. They had to, but I'll get that in a moment. They had a society that they had to love for them to act in the way that they acted to the good of society rather than to political ends. Uh, with the abortion law, we have a death of the Christian consensus. In fact, it is now a state, we now live in a state of hedonism. Society cannot be judged because we cannot even determine whether a thing is a person or not. In other words, is this baby a person? No. Is this man a person? No. Is this whatever a person? If it's not actually a person, they can say yes. The dog is a person. That's why we have dog moms. That's why we have cat moms, and so on and so forth. It flows from this logical thought that if things aren't human, they non-humans can become human. Julius Caesar talked about this. As we all have read, they used to have an abortifacient herb that they actually rendered extinct because the Romans overused it. At the same time, same levels of hedonism, something happens. There is no longer an absolute by which to judge society. There's no law. There's no personhood. There's no human. There's no human in the human. No, anyway. The humanism has completed its life cycle, and now the fruit is known, right? Whereas before they enjoyed the prosperity of the freedoms of a Christian society. Now it is lost. There is no absolute to judge society. If, and this is very important, if you're taking notes, write this down. If you're memorizing this, memorize it. If there is no absolute by which we can judge society, society itself is absolute. If there is no absolute by which to judge society, society is absolute. There's an extra comma in there. I hate it. This is the big line. This is the thesis statement of this portion of how should we then live. So that leads to a question. How can we escape? Well, we have discovered that we cannot replace God within or with society. So we must seek our Creator. In other words, the whole that is in society cannot be filled with society. After all, society has the whole. You cannot fill a wounded self with itself. It's going to bleed out. Because we cannot replace God, and because we cannot fill the whole with society, we must either choose apathy or God. Actually, there's different choices that we can make. I'm going to start describing them soon. The big thing, though, is that without society, without the moral absolutes governing society in their own way, you still had elites and great men and all and governments and all this jazz. You actually have a severe decrease in elites. In fact, I would say that the managerial revolution was not a creation of a new elite class, but rather a severe degradation of the role of elite classes within society. In other words, people who would be petty elites within a business, within a college, whatever you have, no longer were able to be true elites. In the end, the system, the society, the absolute society, as wounded as it was the thing making and breaking elites. Therefore, they weren't really sporting against each other. They were sporting like two peacocks for the attention of one disinterested peahen. So, with, let's see here, this lack of elites created a hunger and recognition for elites. This is the source for the technocrat elites that we, uh, excuse me. I have another live stream coming up, and I'm also organizing that at the same time. John C. Wright, do check us out later. This led to the creation of a new class of elites, the technocrats. And this is stuff that Francis Schaeffer sang in 1970. Remember, men like Daniel Bell wrote about it, and I'm about to talk about his work in just a second. Excuse me. Daniel Bell wrote a book called The Coming of a Post-Industrial Society. He had a warning within it that goes like this. The lack of a rooted moral belief system is the cultural contradiction of the society, the deepest challenge of society. In other words, because there's no acting without morals breeds nemesis. That's the way I would rewrite it. The technocratic elites are a part of the system created by the system, but they aren't necessarily part of the Christian flow, the momentum that was there before. In the same way, men like the new men, like Cicero and not Julius Caesar, but the new men in general in Rome were the closest thing to technocratic elites that you can get. So too do you have things like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. I'm neither saying that they're good or bad in this case. I'm just saying that they are a natural growth within the system. Elon Musk may be rich as Crassus. However, he doesn't have those Roman virtues in the same way. And so when Elon Musk has his issues, it often flows from a lack of a solid moral basis by which he can go on that would have been given him, like Crassus, from Christianity or a dedication to the Roman state and society that bred so many heroes. There's a loss of meaning and purpose within the technocratic elite because their absolute belief in society, even if they hate it, it's clown world or whatever, but in actuality, they would not live anywhere else. Even if they were to live in like Papua New Guinea, they would still bring with them the trappings of the society that the Western society, godless or no. They may complain about it. It's like people going to Vietnam or Thailand or Japan or China or whatever, for the cheap living, man. But in reality, they just want a cheaper way to live the exact same way that they did in America, except perhaps with less people who know them and speak their language. It's it's a result of the need to generate meaning and ethic. There's no absolute ethic, to accompany the absolute power. It's arbitrary elite taking over and giving arbitrary absolutes to society. What's a good example of this? The H-1B visa issues that happened 6 months ago and still kind of quietly goes on in the background. In other words, we understand that American workers need jobs and need a society. We also understand that it is better to give our neighbor, the job than it is to give some foreigner the job. As an example, excuse me, they attack my throat. Pardon me, pardon me. You listen to the silence. I hope that silence was as good for you as it was for me, baby. Anyway, I'll have to drink more water. I don't know. What this means is that humanism, which only really worked within a Christian society and perspective, has failed. And that to enjoy the benefits of a non chaotic Christian society, we must return to the Creator, the non chaotic freedoms. So this isn't Bronze Age mindset. I'm not talking about, you know, roving the seas, piracy, or anything like that. What I'm talking about is like normal good behavior of normal good people, like the average crofter. Sure, plenty of Anglos went out pirating and then became a crofter, a farmer, whatever, later on. But I'm talking about, this is different stages. What I'm attacking is not necessarily the humanism of Bronze Age mindset. I'm attacking the humanism of personal peace and affluence and its handmaiden apathy, which also Bronze Age pervert attacks, but in a different way. So I want to make that connection. Why is this org group, why are people in this sphere, why is somebody talking about it and thinking he's going to get an audience? Well, it's because these are different points at it. Bap takes his work from a very non-Christian perspective. Um, but he also doesn't expect there to be a Christian society. He rails against the zombie Hulk of the dead Christian society that's forcing us to be less than men, empty chested, and yet we're expected to breed, as C.S. Lewis says. One of the mistakes I think people make is that people often look to things like Hitler and Stalin, for their humanism fix of tyranny and authoritarianism. But in reality, or even before that, to think people like Julius Caesar, Alexander for a certain heroic humanism. But in reality, the technocratic elite, which is the sort of the new kids on the block, power wise, are subtle, manipulative, but also authoritarian. Excuse me, it's my cheat day, and I had a pizza, and that was a mistake. Mistakes of youth. Excuse me. Uh, there's an inhumanity to men like Peter Thiel taking over society that wasn't there with Stalin. Stalin killed a lot of people. He was inhuman. But fundamentally, his society and punishments were meted out to people by people. There was nothing automatic about it. Whatever people say about Hitler's choices and his relationship to the Jews, it was also humans to humans, right? The real massacres that we find are often connected to the actions of human individuals. Whereas nowadays, there's subtle and manipulative rhetoric being used, subtle manipulative forces. It's gay. You will go into the longhouse. You will enjoy a delicate IPA, and you'll talk about briskets. Yes, you will talk about briskets, or you will be disenfranchised. I was watching a Sam Hyde video, and he talks about how society doesn't accept anger. I can say that for myself. Many times I have shown anger, and every time I have been punished for it. I'm not punished for lying. I'm not punished for cheating. I'm not punished even for sexual immorality. But I yell, and all of a sudden things come out of the woodwork to punish me. This is the sort of society that is. Um, and it manipulates you, right? It's not punishing you for this or that, or cheating, or bodybuilding, or abandoning God, right? Society will not punish you for degrading yourself or even improving yourself in a humanistic way. But the second that you sort of call for that higher power, that higher nature, they attack you. This sort of perverse system of incentives is creates what I'm going to call a Skinner tyrant, as in from Skinner box experiments. You have to do these things. You are punished for doing these things. You must live a certain way. You are punished for living a good and godly way. But at the same time, this tyrant isn't in your face. It's in the incentives itself. How do you defeat the incentives itself? You must find another way. These Skinner tyrants simply cannot be defeated by force of arms unless you directly murder them, which I, of course, cannot recommend, and I'm not calling for. The power is in the person, less than the tech, but at the same time, all of these people are creating automatic systems wherever possible, either through AI or through whatever you have to create. Their utopias, their authoritarian Skinner tyrannies. One of the big signs of that is, again, genetic engineering. There's no Spartan elders deciding on which children live or die based on, whether they're, a Downey or something like that. They had a loyalty to the state. They had a loyalty to their people. They wanted the best for their people, and that included the people within it. However, now we have things like hatred to the people, to the parents. We have hatred to the state and society. Excuse me. This hatred builds and builds and builds, and it creates more and more troubles for us as we go on, as I've been describing. There's a loss of the order of what pathetic order, but order nonetheless, that humanism, personal peace and affluence, and apathy provided. There's no moderating virtue. The Greek fought each other all the time. Their states were often in a state of civil war. Or they had tyrants rising and falling every 20 years. All the stuff that's happening in Syracuse. Heroes like Timoleon rising up and killing his own brother to prevent the overthrow of the Corinthian state. You had these things, and it came from a certain amount of virtue. The unvirtuous are commented on. Alcibiades had some things that we Christians would call unvirtuous, but in reality, the Greeks looked up to as if he was a hero. Excuse me. So there was absolutes that society followed, even in the state of man against man. When they lived out, things like Silenus saying, it's good to not be born, and if you're born, it's good to die fast. They lived that. Because it was an absolute sort of statement that they understood. They had to live fast. They had to do this or that, or they had to live for pleasure, and that led to many different philosophical, disagreements on these things. Are you a hedonist? Are you an Epicurean? Are you a Stoic? It created ideologies. It created greater ideas. Some people call, like, I've heard from Bath and others, Critias as Hitler, but quite frankly, uh, you know, I would say that Critias probably had more martial virtue than Hitler did, as an example, or Critias as Stalin, more physicality than Stalin did. He famously had a withered hand that he hid from his photographs. There's a self consciousness in the modern man that, from what's recorded of men like that, this just isn't there. Um, with genetic engineering, separate from love of the state, there's no reason, again, to deny that, there's no reason not to deny whether or not such and such a person is a human. Are they a human if they're modified, or are they not a human if they're not modified? These ideas, are you a higher human if you're modified, or are you a higher human if you're natural? Excuse me. Now, with the new technocratic elites, you have a society being given its arbitrary absolutes. There is no conspiracy, just soft power and influence. In other words, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and others are, quite frankly, not much of a conspiracy. They might have had, some government contracts here and there, but that's less of a conspiracy than, say, Amazon or Bill Gates, who were, explicitly paid for, to be tech giants by the U.S. government a long, long time ago. Now, they could have failed, but they didn't, but they could have failed. Whereas people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and others seem to be growing off of the society rather than society deliberately planting them, if that makes sense. A lot of them came from things like the dot-com bubble, and other things like that. Total dominance is unneeded from these guys, but they have enough reach. Again, I'm not saying that they're like all these evil people or anything like that. However, I am saying how they work as elites having power over society. They don't need to walk stormtroopers through the streets. If they use Twitter, for example, to suppress certain ideas, they still suppress a ton of the power behind it. Media is the same way. It's why the boomers are one-shotted by TV. If we're one-shotted by a cultivated doom scroll, yeah, what can you say? Again, they're without loyalty to their state or their people, but they are loyal to a society that treats society as its own absolute. Excuse me. Just scrolling down my notes. What's more, also the creation of the worship of government beyond ideology is part and parcel of our daily life. Many people say the government must solve my problems to maintain my personal peace and affluence without God. It is a total loss of freedom. People who like the guys who always argue with, oh, I'm just traveling. I don't need my license registration to travel. These people are arguing, but they still worship government. They still worship law. Things like people lining up for their welfare stamps, their SNAP benefits, and then buying, liters and liters of Coca-Cola. It's all the same worship of the government, the worship of themselves, personal peace, affluence, apathy, total loss of freedom. The reason why we didn't have these problems the same way in the past, or if we did, we could moderate them with, moral living, was that Christ's salvation gave society a massive range of non-chaotic freedom. You could be a truly great man like Robert Guiscard or Oliver Cromwell in a Christian society and still have a moral basis by which to judge these men. At times, Oliver Cromwell has been the great villain. At times, he's been the great hero. And I'm sure that men of the time of Robert Guiscard, of the Crusaders, of William Marshall and St. Louis had their own opinions. But St. Louis could do heroic things like go on crusades, fight, lived the life of a truly ideal king because he was Christian, not just because he was a truly great man. In other words, the freedom that I see described by a lot of the alt right was present in old Christianity. And I don't mean the sense of like, there's new Christians and old Christians and it's a new salvation. I mean that those people of the old salvation, the true, true death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, could live in a way that the alt right or new right or whatever the fuck they're calling us these days, prescribe. They would work out. They would choose higher natures to abhor the thought and all this jazz. And they would do it because they had the freedom to do it. They weren't driven by their lusts. They weren't driven by their neuroses. They could be, but they could choose a higher level of morality. And that, again, gave them great freedom. I know it's strange to hear about Christianity and becoming a Christian. Don't you guys have that slave morality as a way of freedom? But it is. I can choose a non-chaotic way of life. I can choose a way to live morally with society without society being my absolute. It covers for the flaws of personal peace and affluence, and it kills apathy. Without Christianity, the good freedoms that we had under Christianity, again, Christianity is a zombie Hulk collapsing around us. The Christian society, I mean. The good freedoms given to us by, Christian society, destroy society and render it formless. This is why Christianity today seems so weak. Why it deserves to be mocked in certain ways. The deeper nature of Christianity is lost by the smothered by, personal peace and affluence. Now, keep in mind, for a good Christian, they're broken free, right? It's like the chains are broken on them. But for many others, they're stuck in this cycle. I have an uncle, very rich, but I've heard him pray, and it's very pathetic. He treats this Christianity like a sop and a way to live morally, but in reality, he worships money and treats society as an absolute. And he doesn't like it when my half of the family, acts in the Christian way rather than in the dog eat dog moral society way. It causes a tension within him. It's why normies, when they run up against a true Christian or even a free alt-right man or something like that, like BAP or whatever, to a certain degree, people who are broken free of their chains, causing them to act within society in a certain way, in the longhouse, as some people call it, is that they act in visceral horror. They create, hateful comments. Other examples include men like Fox Day and Owen Benjamin. They broke the chains on them thanks to the power of Christ, as well as their own personal wills. And, they were able to create something for themselves that had to be destroyed. They haven't really deplatformed BAP in the same way, but they absolutely did their damnedest to deplatform Fox Day and Owen Benjamin because they understood the danger. Freedom is dangerous to the Longhouse society, the absolute self-worshipping society, the society that worships itself as an absolute. What's also even more dangerous is men with the potential to raise up higher level ideas, create fires within the spirit that also point to Christ. Because a man who's a Christian can look at society and spit on it. I don't give a fuck what society says. I've never given a fuck what society says. Why in the world should I care what some people who can't stop stuffing their fat faces and paying for OnlyFans thoughts think? It's disgusting, it's degrading, it's degenerate, it's hateful to God, and they recoil in shock horror. You know, I tried to set up two people. I thought, some things about some people that turned out not to be true, but they were like, oh, and then it's like, no, like this is, having two people, fall in love is a beautiful thing, but Ben, we're at a workplace. We're at this and that. No, no, no. If you choose that higher freedom, if you choose a society that doesn't value society, what happens is that you create a better and higher form of life beyond the humanistic rationality that is lost upon the death of those who still benefit from the zombie Christian society that came before. Again, I'm describing our terms in both current and past tense, right? You have to understand that it's one of those asymptotic graphs, right? We went down pretty heavily in the 1970s, but now we're slowly grinding down. Christianity is alive, and it's also a zombie Hulk. There's still pockets of strong Christian moral character in parts of the US, and there's also absolutely degenerate places that used to be very Christian in the same breath. You have to keep these two things active. The alt-right is anti-Christian in some ways, but the alt-right also reflects Christian values. The left has certain Christian values, but in reality, they take them and they worship them, turning those, helping the poor and stuff like that, and turning them into the very things that they are trying to destroy society, Christianity, God, the family, males, whites, whatever you want with. And they do it with the law, replacing religion. So, in other words, hate crime laws. You can't criticize Israel. You can go to church, but you better not do it in the wrong way or too close to an abortion clinic. The boomers took these ideas, the law more, the freedom that Christ gives a society because it no longer has to longhouse itself or whatever you want to say. A man can go to church in that atmosphere, but he doesn't worship God. Instead, he demands what he wants from God like a dog, come here, Rover, come here, God, do this thing, fix this thing for me, and I will do nothing. I only want my personal peace and affluence, my apathy. The courts will defend my rights more religiously than I do myself, more religiously than my Bible. The law matters. The law, is the religious power of the land. This is what he says, and he rejects God, even though at the same time he's going to church. This is what I'm talking about with these ideas of contradictory terms. It's beyond, not beyond good and evil, but it's beyond a simple logical throw. The Christ is glorified by non-Christian things, but at the same time, he's not glorified by certain things people call Christian. And this is one of them. The greatness in Christianity grew not as from some sort of humanistic excellence, but a recognition of chaos and evil. In other words, Christianity didn't create great things, create the great society that we mourn the passing of through longhousing people, gelding its people, destroying its fighting spirit, but providing an order within the chaos of the natural living existence. We did not have an absolute society in the medieval period. Thanks to the internet, thanks to TV, we do now. And it's becoming chaotic. Society is committed to apathy. This is why we have no uncomfortable revolts until recently with the destruction of lands by immigration. In other words, there's some revolt stuff happening in Ireland right now where they're burning down buildings meant for migrants. But on the other hand, it must be very uncomfortable. They have to do it at night. They have to have supreme OPSEC. They have to make sure that there's no traitors in their ranks. But if you countermand that to things like the No Kings riots, or to the protests that went on yesterday, in my city, St. Louis, they were all geriatric. Maybe 10, 20% of the people were young. vibrant, full of life. Most of them were baby boomers. Those who have been watching this stream may understand why. The baby boomers, while they were personal peace and affluent and apathetic, still have a religious absolutist devotion to society. And I know it's strange, right? Committed to apathy, also committed to society, but it's like being committed to the engine of your car. You would not say I'm committed to my car engine. You'd say I'm committed to my car. It's like that. Uh, Humanism demanded total autonomy, and refused God completely. It could not give us freedoms, not one bit. In other words, even though the baby boomers enjoyed their personal peace and affluence and all the freedoms and all this jazz, they could not add any freedoms to it that weren't destructive to society. They could not create anything for society that would not be rejected by Christian society. In other words, they try to inject steroids or something into the zombie Hulk to keep it going just a little longer, but in reality, it couldn't. What happens is that there's signs and tearing at the seams and holes within society growing like a garment stretched too far. You have economic breakdowns, inflation forever, terrorism, threat of war, fear of nuclear war, starvation, and human suffering. And of course, it must be alleviated by more government, more money, more ideas, but never by the boomer raising his hand to do it. It's easy to sell their land to immigration. It's not easy to leave an inheritance because of all these things causing them to destroy society even as they worship it. Those who worship personal peace and affluence will give up everything to keep their worship. But under these pressures, personal peace and affluence will crack and crumble to dust. There are, of course, two answers after the silence. Excuse me. Thank you for being understanding. There are two answers to this uh, unstated problem, right? Society is crumbling to dust, but they refuse to save society by giving up their personal peace and affluence and apathy. Either we will experience an imposed order, which we are already experiencing from the technocratic elites, or most likely the technocratic elites. Somebody is going to impose order. My money and Francis Schaeffer's money. What I know I haven't said his name in a long while, but this is who we're talking about. His How Should We Then Live was on the technocratic elites. We talked about the book from Daniel Bell. These things are very, very, very important. These things are somewhat inevitable by the technology that we have today. Or the second answer to the question of society crumbling, but people refusing to give up their personal peace and affluence, is that society affirms the base that gave us freedoms. Now, this isn't magical, everyone becomes Christianity. This is instead a release of society being the absolute, and instead morality having an absolute attached to it. Now, this is kind of a little bit shaky because it's, you can't magically make people religious, right? The Ortho Bros failed miserably. They were an internet movement. They had like one good debater and the rest were the usual shitters that Orthodox has always put forward outside of their own enclaves. Sorry to any Ortho Bros out there, but I've seen some crap. It's like in the second answer, Christianity cannot be treated as a means to an end. It is not superior utilitarianism. If we want utilitarianism, we'll just say fuck it and put ecstasy into the water like we should have. No. is not superior utilitarianism. Christianity is not solved by putting people into Skinner boxes until they become religious. This is not to Christianity cannot be treated like it's a tool. Christianity is a relationship between man and God. Things are not a chance. God does not roll dice, as they say. Creator God is in control and demands our acceptance of Christ our Savior. We must have the moral absolutes that the Bible gives us for the second question to work, answer to the question to work. The benefit for those who accept salvation and beyond salvation is a unity of truth and knowledge and a power to change society. Christians have then a responsibility to take power within a society. They don't have to be the majority to influence consensus. This is very important. Many times I've heard, well, Christians are hypocrites. Sometimes I joke, oh yeah, I'm a hypocritical Christian too. I do this and I do that, and I'm a glutton and all this jazz. But in reality, the fact that I recognize my sin and reject it does not make me a hypocritical Christian. It's the same with a hypocritical leftist. A leftist who is obsessed with personal peace and affluence and apathy is not a hypocrite when they say Republicans, I don't even fucking know. When they basically say something that a boomer says is hypocritical, right? They say, oh, they're the real hypocrites. Oh, they're the real racists. Well, in reality, they're acting exactly according to their religion, their view of society, their things that they believe will cause salvation. Christians should have done the same thing. The secret to Christianity is not just the salvation of Jesus Christ, is that fundamentally there are always those within Christianity who pursue Christianity for the wrong reasons and are never true Christians, but they still have influence over society. While you can imagine that creates horror and confusion and, a pedophile priest and all this other stuff, what it is a natural offlowing from power, from society, from social pressure. The in reality, what caused humanism to be over uh, excuse me, in reality, what caused humanism to be over society in general was not some sort of, secret sauce that everyone decided to imbibe in 1931. No, it's not Bauhaus art. No, it's the fact that a power grew within the West that was not Christian in nature. The fact is that most people pretending to be Christians was normal. People would, pretend to be Christian and then they go to a bathhouse or a whorehouse or whatever you want. There's been plenty of Habsburgs with doxies. They also went to church religiously every Sunday. Their religion was not necessarily their set of beliefs. They worshiped power and acted in a way that would make their power and their power over others, their authority, most amenable to their populace. You can see this in things like the Reformation and the wars of the Reformation. One Habsburg says he doesn't give a shit as long as you stay loyal to him. Another Habsburg is loyal to the Catholic Church over the state he rules. You also see this with things in Christianity, in American Christianity. John D. Rockefeller was famously, religious, but at the same time, murders were carried out in the name of his company. He, had a monopoly. He destroyed many lifestyles and lives in his pursuit for more money, more monopolistic control. He went golfing with his parson every Sunday. How can you say that, like I've said in previous streams, how can you say that that man was a Christian in the same way that someone like Oliver Cromwell was, who had a similar level of power, but also called upon the name of Christ to determine his actions and acted in a way he best believed honored God and also preserve the country that he was regent over or fighting for, depending on what part of your life he's in. Uh, he and others, Rockefeller even, experienced a freedom to power from Christian morals. What Christianity offers is the basis and foundation and lack of chaos that society, which views itself as an absolute, has to have as its internal guiding light, like the North Star itself. Their worldview, your worldview, the Christian's worldview, the humanist worldview, even, does not explain the existence of the universe or its form, nor the uniqueness of man. And yet, I flubbed that up. Sorry. Who is your? Oh, right. So the humanist says, the humanist experiences what I'm about to describe. If I was to speak to one, I would say, your worldview does not explain the existence of the universe or its form, nor the uniqueness of man, and yet you refuse and suppress that which gives its answer. In other words, the humanist, as I've said before in this statement, in this live stream, rejects God, but at the same time demands the same answers from God. Then that creates a tension within society, a nemesis, retribution from God. All things of God are easily seen. God cannot be hidden. So, in other words, the humanist denies God, but at the same time, we see God work. It's like with Donald Trump being narrowly missed. You could say it was a shaky gooner's hands that, slipped on the 22 rifle or whatever it was on that rooftop. But in reality, we all know that he had a good shot on Donald Trump, and Donald Trump just turned his head the right way at the right time and saved us from whoever the fuck would have run. The hand of God is evidence, and it's clear. We joke about it, we meme about it, but in reality, we all saw it. The humanist has no answer for the existence of the universe, and yet they reject the answer that this God exists, but has spoken, has indeed his central message that people come to him with Christ, but it carries requirements. It creates freedoms without chaos. It is that freedom without chaos or an imposed order that we have benefited from as a society from Christianity's dominance. The worship of things and man and apathy cannot continue. What is will be what is. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to reach out to some people and see if they have anything they want to say. And then we'll continue on. I will go off and prepare for our next stream. Excuse me. Francis Schaeffer's "How Should We Then Live" is a great thing to watch in general. I would recommend it to everyone, especially those who are curious as to the setup of the world and how everything fits together like a glove, right? Like the world isn't just one strain, one conspiracy, one whatever, right? It's a whole lot of things working together to create a sort of uh, societal movement, right? Like if you were to say something like, well, it's the Martians who create everything and control this and that, and you can't criticize them. The Martians must be stopped in their conspiracy or whatever. But let's just say, not all Martians participate in these things, Martians, but also not all, but like there's also some Earthlings who participate in like pornography and stuff like that, who don't necessarily uh, have any connection with the bloodlines of Mars, or with the Martian state, or anything of that nature, right? There's evil men in government, like Biden is a wasp, and most of his people around him were wasps, but he also had a large Martian coterie following him as well. So who's in charge? Well, it's clear that sometimes the Martians don't get what they want. The governmental ones anyway. The pornography ones, are incredibly insecure. You have certain people, freaking out whenever they're criticized. That doesn't speak of power, right? That doesn't speak of authority. They don't go to the police all the time. They just go, how dare you criticize Mars, and weep and stuff like that. They create this emotional thing. So the conspiracy that just pins it all on them doesn't really work. The conspiracy that pins it all on stranger ideas, to I don't know, hollow earth, not necessarily hollow earth, but what was I trying to say, flat earth and stuff like that. They say it's a conspiracy. They say Tataria is a conspiracy. These things don't actually have power to them. They don't actually create any force within society. The reason why flat earthers are even known by people is because their idea is so outrageous that the news and other things treat them as lol cows, right? If you look at people who criticize, as in blame everything on Martians or something like that, they, put it all on there. But we all know that, one, not all Martians participate, and two, not all authority is carried by the Martians. Therefore, it's an incomplete view of society and the downfall of society. Fundamentally, Christianity has had an antagonistic relationship, both from the Martians to Christians and less vice versa. In reality, many times they've been let in, and then problems happen, and then they're successfully kicked out. These things create resentment and stuff like that, but in reality is largely forgotten by, like England or Germany or France or Spain or whoever did it. It's the creation of the Inquisition, not to punish Christians, but rather to ensure Christian conformity across its lines. These things are difficult to wrap your head around, right? It's another one of those contradictory things. The boomer loves power, personal peace, affluence, apathy, whatever you want, but he also refuses to ensure its good condition. It's like running a car into the ground. Like I described, it's the zombie train. They've stolen all the grease, replaced all the wheels. The engine's dead, but it's still going a little downhill, but they're eyeing that uphill slope pretty damn hard. It's even though it's the creation, even though it's like that, right? Even though it's like that, sort of, how do I want to put it? And of course, they also have Christianity as one of their rallying cries, even though they are not Christian at all. I want to be very clear on that. They are not true Christians. If you ask them what makes them a Christian, they'd say, "Oh, I'm a good person." They might mention something about Jesus. "Oh, I love Jesus. He died for me." That's not the same as faith. That's not the same as being a Christian, right? If you ask them, okay, so Christ says, you go to the prisons and the poor and stuff like that, what did you do? Well, they might say something like, "I gave money to Africa." Well, the problem is that if you gave money to Africa during the South Carolina thing, God says love your neighbor. He doesn't say, you know, love the far neighbor. The Samaritan was affluent and close. He recognized the man on the ground. He understood who he was. The man on the ground was likely Jewish. His first two responsible people, the Pharisee and the chief priest, should have helped him. They should have helped him. But in the end, the Good Samaritan helped him. You see where that is, where that morality comes from. Even though it's, the Good Samaritan helping his neighbor, one, the Good Samaritan had the power to help his neighbor. Two, the responsibility to help his neighbor, the help the guy on the ground, the guy injured, was to the chief priest and the Pharisee before the Samaritan. And three, the Samaritan did not steal, did not do anything destructive, did not borrow or whatever. He said that here's the money for taking care of him, and I'm going to come back this way. And if you spent more than this, I'll pay you back. In other words, there wasn't a destruction of property like we're seeing today. Excuse me. Water. So, they would say something like that, but, you just heard what I just said. And so you say, okay, well, it also says something like, you visit the people in prisons, or the sick and the elderly and the widows and the orphans. Have you done that? Well, they might say something like, oh, I did that shoebox thing, which is something, but it's like the barest thing, it's like God says that all our righteousness is like filthy rags, but at the same time, there are verses that imply that we'll be rewarded in heaven for our deeds, not like for our deeds, but how God views our deeds. If God's like, if that's, something he's going to reward, he's going to flip you a copper penny. It's like, you did it. I'm a just God. I'm not going to say you didn't do it, but you didn't do much, did you? Whereas somebody like the widow who gave 2 mites, somebody who you could call, of a boomer generation, but she gave all she had to the poor, to the temple, whatever. Jesus praised that specifically. It's not the amount of money or what you do, it's the spirit in which you do it. If you say something like, well, for what I do often is when I hear a church congregant is sick, I go visit them in the hospital. I sit with them for a little bit, chat with them if I know them. It's weird when you get somebody you don't know just showing up out of the blue. It's just I can't stand it personally when I've been sick. I don't. It's weird. It always feels weird when I, it's the bad vibe is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't help them heal. But you can still write them a card. Hey, get well soon. It's the same sort of thing. That's the sort of thing Jesus is talking about. A real sacrifice of 2 to 3 hours of your life on the day going and helping somebody in a hospital. Now, the prison thing is a little different because the Romans often put innocent people in the prison and they weren't cared for, right? The bare minimum to keep them alive, if that. They didn't have human rights. So, it's a little different situation. But it's like, you can do that too. Jesus calls for it. You should do it. But at the same time, it's like, don't do it stupidly. Are you doing it to somebody who actually deserves it? Or are you doing it for somebody who, murdered 3 people and now you're just simping for him? Like a teenager who's just watched a Manson film or something like that. It's it's like the spirit of Christianity is not the same as the form that American Christians or many Christians often take. In fact, what Francis Schaeffer supports is something like a rival castle, elite theory. He supports Christians not necessarily becoming the major group, but rather maintaining power through organized minority elites. And I don't mean minority like black or something. I mean in the sense of Christians who aren't in the majority, acting like Machiavellian elites. Because, quite frankly, it's not a sin to act like Machiavelli, it's a sin to abandon God and lose. It's 5 o'clock. I got to go take care of some more stuff for my stream in an hour. I really want to thank you guys for joining. Do check us out. We'll be having John C. Wright on. It's going to be absolutely delightful. He's a great guest, and we'll have a great show. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the future. Next week, I think I'm going to talk about Bloodborne. Maybe. I'm thinking about it. Maybe.